Hey there everyone, it's Russell. Welcome to the Reading Fabricator. I hope you're all doing well, and today I'm going to talk about a very serious piece of non-fiction work, both in topic and just in writing in general. And that is a book called Darkness Visible, a memoir of madness by William Styron. Most people would know William Styron as being one of the more popular authors of the latter half of the 20th century. He wrote The Confessions of Nat Turner, and probably his most popular novel would be Sophie's Choice, which was adapted into the Meryl Streep film, which everyone knows and loves. He's very well regarded, but with Darkness Visible, he did something that had not been done before, at least in quite this amount of depth. He wrote about the topic of depression, which at the time of the publishing of the book was rarely spoken about in the written form, except with regards to, I guess, fiction. When it comes to non-fiction, his was the real first piece of work that basically shined a light on the seriousness of this mental health disorder. Now, I came upon this book about 6 years ago, back in 2017, maybe 2018, and I read it purely because of the reputation it had as being something that affected a lot of people quite emotionally, quite deeply, how it spoke to them. And I will admit that even though I have had some mental health issues in the past, but none of that happened before reading this book. So at the time I read this book the first time, I was reading it purely as an outside observer, just trying to get to the mind of people who had this affliction. But then it was a year after reading that where I myself started having some mental health issues, and now it's all sorted out now, but I was very hesitant to return to this book after having those problems because I wasn't sure how I'd interpret it or perceive it, or if it would basically reawaken those things in me. But I will say that reading it the second time around, I was much more deeply affected than I was the first time I read it. I wrote it off the first time I read it. I just didn't really think much of it. Now, having experienced the things that he talks about in the book, I can say that with great honesty that he nailed it perfectly. And it's a very short non-fiction book. I mean, it's about like 80 pages long. So, I mean, I read it within one afternoon, and even a week later, a week after reading it, I still have feel the effects of some of the written paragraphs that he's put in this thing. You can tell that William Styron was a great writer, and having read Darkness Visible now, I really want to go back and read his entire bibliography, because if his writing for this piece of non-fiction is even half as good as his fiction, then I'll be amazed with his output, basically. In Paris, on a chilly evening late in October of 1985, I first became fully aware that the struggle with the disorder in my mind, a struggle which had engaged me for several months, might have a fatal outcome. So basically what happens is, through this non-fiction book, I mean, the first couple of chapters are dedicated to when he went to Paris to receive this award. And while driving through Paris, I think to the hotel room, he spots a place that he had once visited when he was much younger. And for some reason, it hit him deeply, it hit him hard. And it was through this that he came to the realization that he was in a really bad state of mind. When he accepted the award, he just was not feeling right. He was not himself. He was invited to this luncheon, basically, with all the chairmen of the board who awarded the award, and he just had to decline because he had to say personally that he just was sick. So he goes to see a psychiatrist when he goes back to America, and what follows is his detailed description of the beginning of his depression through to the night where he almost took his own life. Interspersed throughout this is his talks about the psychology behind the official term depression and its rooted word melancholia, and where that word melancholia came from, the effect that depression has had on various artists and authors that he came to know and who have since died, and authors of the past, showing that this depression seems to be deeply rooted in humanity and has been documented throughout history in written form. It's very interesting stuff, actually, the way he intersperses his own mental afflictions and his detailing of it versus everything that he has documented and researched with regards to depression. And he's someone that during the midst of his depression, he was reading the doctor's manuals, he was reading up on everything to do with that. He was trying to research it, trying to come to terms with it. There's a lot of talks here about how he knew Abby Hoffman and what happened to Abby Hoffman when he died, whether it was a suicide or not. Talking to Albert Camus, who died in a car crash days before he was going to meet with William Styron, but who spoke of depression in his work, and I just found that very interesting. So many authors of the 20th century and even before that just seem to have this sense of melancholy and depression, not just in their personal lives, but in their work as well. And he gives you a list of all these authors who it just afflicted them so much. And he sort of comes to a realization that there seems to be a growing theme among writers. I mean, you look at like Sylvia Plath, Ernest Hemingway, and Emily Dickinson, and the list just goes on and on and on, all going back hundreds of years. But it's the way he writes. It's so beautifully written, absolutely stylistically perfect, that I was in shock with how much he was able to convey with just certain words and certain sentences. I mean, his descriptions of depression are just absolutely top tier. Depression is a disorder of mood, so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self, to the mediating intellect, as to verge close to being beyond description. There's just little things like that just thrown in there throughout the book where I just sit back and go, wow, that is perfectly articulated. Nothing else I've come across just comes close to being as beautifully descriptive as that is. And it's not just that, he talks about the method of madness as well towards the latter half of the end of the book. And when you get to the mid-section onwards, where he actually talks about his own personal dealings with it, and you just see the different segments of problems that afflict him leading up to that fateful night, you see that this is a man who has almost succumbed to his illness, that no matter how much he's tried to research it and tried to keep it at bay, it almost got a hold of him. But there is silver lining in this, because he does survive it. He does get over it, and he has written a book about it, so you know he survives it. And it's sort of a little bit of a glint of hope for those out there. He does go on in the final chapter to talk about how, even though a lot of people do suffer from depression, in the book it states 1 in 10 Americans, but that was statistics based on like 35 years ago, so it's probably all changed now. The scientific studies have all changed, but at the time of writing, 1 in 10 were afflicted with this disease, and he talks about, even though many will be affected by it, most of them will overcome it and get back to a sort of sense of normalcy. When he sees that Hotel Washington sign traveling through Paris, he gives this description. It was at some point during the course of these musings that the sign Hotel Washington swam across my vision, bringing back memories of my long ago arrival in the city, along with the fierce and sudden realization that I would never see Paris again. This certitude astonished me and filled me with a new fright, for while thoughts of death had long been common during my siege, blowing through my mind with icy gusts of wind, they were the formless shapes of doom that I supposed are dreamed of by people in the grip of any severe affliction. The difference now was in the sure understanding that tomorrow, when the pain descended once more, or tomorrow after that, certainly on some not too distant tomorrow, I would be forced to judge that life was not worth living, and thereby answer for myself at least the fundamental question of philosophy. That's just brilliant writing right there. So if you just not take into account the subject matter, if you just look at it from a purely writing perspective, this man is a genius at conjuring sentences. But it's more than that. It's so much more than that. This is a non-fiction book under 100 pages where he just throws just an absolutely heavy-handed topic at you, something that he himself has had to deal with. And he gives it to you with the utmost honesty, as much honesty as you can possibly perceive. He is laying his soul bare for you, and you feel for him, and you feel for other people that you know of depression. And most importantly, if you yourself suffer from depression like I have in the past, you relate to it. And by relating to it, you know that this man has done right with this book, that he has done it perfectly. Sort of in the mid-part section, he talks about articles and about definitions and about the studies and of the medicine that goes towards trying to heal depression, and of psychiatry. He goes into quite a lot of things in such a short span of time, so it's quite a lot to pick up on. But this is something that he put forth based on a report that he read that I think kind of ticked him off a little bit. My annoyance over all this was so intense that I was prompted to write a short piece for the op-ed page of the Times. The argument I put forth was fairly straightforward. The pain of severe depression is quite unimaginable to those who have not suffered it, and it kills in many instances because its anguish can no longer be borne. The prevention of many suicides will continue to be hindered until there is general awareness of the nature of this pain. Through the healing process of time and through medical intervention or hospitalization in many cases, most people survive depression, which may be its only blessing, but to the tragic legion who are compelled to destroy themselves, there should be no more reproof attached than to the victims of terminal cancer. This next part that I'm going to read out is actually quite lengthy, but it gives you an idea of how much it was afflicting him and how badly he was tormented by the disease. There were also dreadful pouncing seizures of anxiety. One bright day on a walk through the woods with my dog, I heard a flock of Canada geese honking high above trees ablaze with foliage, ordinarily a sight and sound that would have exhilarated me. The flight of birds caused me to stop, riveted with fear, and I stopped stranded there, helpless, shivering, aware for the first time that I had been stricken by no mere pangs of withdrawal, but by a serious illness whose name and actuality I was able finally to acknowledge. Going home, I couldn't rid my mind of the line of Baudelaire, dredged up from the distant past, that for several days I had been skittering around at the edge of my consciousness. I have felt the wind of the wings of madness. Our perhaps understandable modern need to dull the sawtooth edges of so many of the afflictions we are heir to has led us to banish the harsh old-fashioned words madhouse, asylum, insanity, melancholia, lunatic, madness. But never let it be doubted that depression in its extreme form is madness. The madness results from an aberrant biochemical process. It has been established with reasonable certainty after strong resistance from many psychiatrists, and not all that long ago, that such madness is chemically induced amid the neurotransmitters of the brain as a result of systemic stress, which for unknown reasons causes a depletion of the chemical norepinephrine and serotonin and the increase of a hormone cortisol. So you see that he's done his research into it, and there's an interesting thing where he keeps on going to this psychiatrist or psychologist, which he refers to as Dr. Gold. He doesn't want to give out the real name for obvious reasons. And this doctor is basically just throwing back all this information that he himself has already read in the, I can't remember what the manual is, but it's that manual that all psychiatrists use when it comes to diagnosing people with certain mental afflictions. So William has absolutely invested his time in researching this thing. When he knew that he was suffering it, he went and tried as hard as he could to diagnose himself and to try and stop it from getting worse, which unfortunately it did get worse. Which unfortunately leads up to the final week or so of his life, where his wife, who knew of his struggles but nonetheless was trying to help him as much as she could, she organised a party, a dinner party, of which he himself was reluctant to be a part of, but for the sake of her, he went along with it. And obviously the dinner guests knew that he was a little bit off. But then midway through the party, he just got up and walked out, didn't say a word or said sorry, and had moved on. And he went upstairs and began preparing for his inevitable death or suicide, basically. So over the next coming days, you know, he went to the lawyer to rewrite his will. He set up about all his papers to be destroyed because he had this thing where he didn't want his papers to be published nearing his death. And he wrote a suicide note, which he claimed to be the hardest part of the whole process. What follows next is probably my favorite passage in the entire book, because it's absolutely beautiful. It's a moment where he comes to the realization that he doesn't want to die, that he needs help, that he came this close to death, but he got pulled out of it and saw that he needed to go to hospital. But even a few words came to seem to me too long-winded, and I tore up all my efforts, resolving to go out in silence. Late one bitterly cold night, when I knew that I could not possibly get myself through the following day, I sat in the living room of my house, bundled up against the chill. Something had happened to the furnace. My wife had gone to bed, and I'd forced myself to watch the tape of a movie in which a young actress who had been in a play of mine was cast in a small part. At one point in the film, which was set in the late 19th century Boston, the characters moved down the hallway of a music conservatory, beyond the walls of which from unseen musicians came a contralto voice, a sudden soaring passage from Brahms' Alto Rhapsody. This sound, which like all music indeed, like all pleasure I had been numbly unresponsive to for months, pierced my heart like a dagger. And in a flood of swift recollection, I thought of all the joys the house had known, the children who had rushed through its room, the festivals, the love of and work, the honestly earned slumber, the voices and nimble commotion, the perennial trial of cats and dogs and birds, laughter and ability and sighing and frocks and curls. All this I realized was more than I could have ever abandoned, even as what I had set out so deliberately to do was more than I could inflict on those memories and upon those so close to me, with whom the memories were bound. And just as powerfully I realized I could not commit this desecration on myself. I drew upon some last glimmer of sanity to perceive the terrifying dimensions of the mortal predicament I had fallen into. I woke up my wife, and soon telephone calls were made. The next day I was admitted to hospital. What follows there is the final couple of chapters. The second last chapter is his recovery in hospital, which there are actually little bits of humor in it. He shows you that he is recovering. There's this funny thing where he's going to an art class, and he sees that the art teacher is trained in a way to almost deal with kids. But over the course of his recovery, which I think was over 7 weeks, he sort of goes from drawing like a simple house with box windows and that sort of thing to eventually sort of doing like clay model faces and things like that. But he talks about it in a very sort of darkly humorous way, which shows that his humor is coming back to him, that he is recovering. It's quite a beautiful chapter actually. It's very nice to get that, following everything that's happened before that. And then the final chapter is probably the most hopeful one yet, where he talks about how most people will recover from this. A lot of people will get it again, but having gone through it in the past, they will have the right techniques to be able to get through it again. And then the final page, he connects it to Dante's Inferno. He talks about how reading Dante's Inferno, the very first and the very last lines, how that could be perceived as being a way of getting through depression as well. So I've got here, in the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood, for I had lost the right path. And then the way the book ends, just like the way Dante's Inferno ends, and so we came forth and once again beheld the stars. I'm just going to leave it at that. That's the perfect way to end this book, and what a great connection that is to Dante's Inferno. I read Dante's Inferno a long time ago, but honestly I can't remember much of it, but I remember those lines, once again beheld the stars. I think that's quite a beautiful, beautiful ending. He leaves you with hope. This is a man who's gone through this, and if you watch the interviews with him, I can't remember, I think it was Charlie Rose, where he talks about the afflictions of it all and how he wouldn't even wish it on the worst person in the world, which I think he described as Heimlich Himmler. He gives you hope. He provides you with comfort and says that most likely you will get through this, whether through psychiatry or through medicine or a combination of the both. That you can beat this thing, that he has beaten it, and he shows you that it is possible. And I think that's a beautiful way to end the book and a wonderful way to end the video. This is powerful and traumatic stuff, but it needs to be talked about, and I think this book needs to be read. Purely, even if you're an outsider to this whole thing, or whether you know someone who has it, or whether you have it yourself, I think this is something that's important, that deserves to be read, and is a brilliant starting stone for me in the works of William Styron. I really want to read Sophie's Choice now, and The Confessions of Nat Turner. I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for watching, and yeah, see you on the next one.